We do want to give an introduction this morning to Dr. Stephen Davey. He has been with us, and many of you have already heard him speak, but I want to just lay out what the Lord has used him to do. He is a senior pastor at Colonial Baptist Church and president of Shepherd's Theological Seminary, as well as principal Bible teacher on Wisdom for the Heart, the broadcast. He attended Liberty University and Tennessee Temple University, graduating in 1981. He holds a Master of Divinity degree from Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary and a Master of Sacred Theology degree from Dallas Theological Seminary. He's been honored with a Doctor of Divinity degree from an STS sister seminary in Chennai, India. He presently maintains a full schedule, leading shepherds, directing Wisdom for the Heart, which is heard on 5 continents throughout the USA and on 241 radio stations and Trans-World Radio, and fulfilling his primary ministry duties as pastor-teacher of Colonial Baptist Church. He's written 3 commentaries and numerous smaller books published by Charity House, Ambassador, and Emerald House Publishers, and Wisdom for the Heart. And just personally would like to commend him to you. I've only known him for this weekend, but just as a man who loves the church, who loves the Word, and that's given testimony by the fact that he's been in his ministry, the Lord's ministry, there at Colonial Baptist Church for 31 years. It takes courage, it takes perseverance, it takes a love for people, and it takes a love for the Word. So I commend him to you as a man who loves the Word and loves God's people. Please give a hand to Dr. Stephen Davey.
Thank you. It's been a real privilege to get to know Chris and the elder team over this weekend. And my heart is warm toward church planters because I have been one. And I shared with the first hour that these are such great days. These are challenging days. I know you're renovating, you're out of space, you're in 2 services, but what a great problem to have. And we have 3 services in the morning still in our church, so I got a little breather today. I'm just preaching twice. This is an easy morning. But these are your good old days. You know, I tell our staff, you know, we talk about those old days as the good old days. Well, let's live them now. And you're doing that now as a church. And you're well led, you're well fed. It's just a privilege to meet with your elder team and get to know their hearts as well. And they took me last night to Calhoun's. And I had for the first time a fried green tomato slice. That's the way to eat vegetables. If I'd only known that as a young kid. So I would have eaten more, but the other elders scarfed them up. I only got half of one, but delicious. Well, I feel a little disadvantaged for you if you're just entering this setting because we're in our 3rd session. If you'll take your New Testament and turn to the letter from Paul to Titus. I know you've spent a lot of time in this. I trust our study will just give an exclamation point. I know your young people have memorized this book from what I've heard. It's so commendable. But we're talking about the different relationships in the family. We've dealt, first of all, with the warning of false teachers who will divide the church and slander the church. And then we dealt with older men. And now for this morning, of all things, the timing of the Lord has us talking about older women. How's that for a Sunday morning, message on older women? And we're going to combine that with younger wives and mothers in this session, and then tonight, younger men. We're in chapter 2 of Titus, and verse 3, where he tells Titus to begin addressing older women. Now, right away, and we dealt with this yesterday, how do you determine who's an older woman? I mean, do you want to touch that? Do you want to get near that one? Okay, most of the women I know are still 29 and holding, okay, even my wife. Well, is he telling Titus to go around asking their age to determine if they're older women or not? Who wants to volunteer to do that? He really gives us a clue here because he's going to talk about older women having enough experience as wives and mothers to turn around and teach younger women. And he doesn't really tell you how long you had to be in that path before you had the experience needed to tutor the younger women. But evidently, these are going to be women who are old enough to have been experienced in this way. And they're qualified to teach younger women. And by the way, if you're wondering who qualifies, it isn't just the fact that they're older. It is the fact that they will match these 4 descriptive phrases that Paul gives to them through Titus. So let me, by way of outline, give you 4 descriptive phrases of these older women. 2 are positive and 2 are negative. Let's begin then at verse 3. Older women, likewise, are to be reverent in their behavior. That's the first and a positive statement. And let me just sort of outline it for you. This is what we would call a sacredness. There is a sacredness about her. Older women are to be reverent. Now, as I work through this text, I found in this paragraph a number of very rare Greek words that aren't used often. In fact, here's one of them. This phrase for reverent behavior never occurs anywhere else in the New Testament text. And so we're helped by going outside the New Testament to discover the nuance of what this means. And the context takes you to the Greek and Roman temples. These temples were managed and maintained by women who were trained in their demeanor. They were taught how to advise visitors who would come to the temple. They were to act as representatives of the god related to the temple where they worked. So you bring that nuance here into this statement, and Paul is describing older women who are representatives of the living God. They live with the idea of advising people how to get along with God, the true and living God they represent. They have the demeanor that's appropriate to someone carrying out sacred duties. That doesn't mean they can't never have any fun. It simply means there's a demeanor about them. There's this reverence about her that she will, like older men, certainly be able to laugh, but to know what to laugh at. With that, Paul adds a negative distinctive, verse 3, they're to be reverent in their behavior and not malicious gossips. If I could put this distinctive into a positive frame of reference, there's not only a sacredness about her, there is a sweetness about her. And the opposite of which is described here as a malicious gossip. And now Paul, if you're old enough in the faith to have read and studied what he writes, he rarely pulls punches. And here's one where he doesn't. In fact, the word he uses for malicious gossips translates the word diabolos, which in this culture or context can be rendered she-devil. The masculine form of diabolos is translated 34 times in the New Testament, devil. So Paul is essentially telling this congregation that older women who are qualified to be teachers of younger women don't talk like the devil. So what would that be like? Well, what does the devil talk like? Well, we know from the New Testament that the devil is an accuser. He is a slanderer. He's always running everybody down, right? He's called the accuser of the brethren. In Revelation 12, verse 10, it'll be late into the tribulation period where Satan will no longer have that access where he goes back and forth before God. If you read the book of Job and chapter 1, he goes into the presence of God and he accuses Job before God. He says, God, the only reason that guy down there is living for you is because you've built a hedge around him and he has life, by the tail. He's got it great. He's accusing Job to God. Now, because he has access to God and will late into the tribulation, you don't know, but that he doesn't have your name every so often on his lips. And he's saying to God, that guy down there, that girl down there, they're really not a good follower of yours, are they? Accusing you, slandering you. And then what does he do to you? He comes to you and he accuses God to you. He whispers into your heart, God doesn't care about you. God doesn't even know you're not even a blip on the radar. In fact, he's tired of you. You're so unfaithful, that's the 4th time you've done that recently. He's probably through with you. You've ever heard those kinds of things? He's accusing God to you. He's running God down. So you bring that into this context here, and Paul is saying, Titus, we need older women in the family who aren't going to tear everybody down, who aren't going to accuse everybody, who aren't going to look for the negative, who aren't going to look for ways to bring people down, but they're going to build the body up. So these are women that have that sense of not only sacredness, but sweetness about their language. Third, there is a sobriety about her. The third distinctive is equally negative. He writes that they shouldn't be malicious gossips nor enslaved to much wine. The word he uses for enslaved describes literal slavery. It means to be held. It means to be controlled against one's will. So he's saying, don't be held by wine. Don't be controlled by that substance. In fact, you could understand this in principle form. He's describing an older woman who is not dependent on a substance to help her through the day, but the Spirit of God to help her face her day. There's one more descriptive phrase, and we'll just call it supportiveness because I'm working on words that start with the letter S, as you can tell. Verse 3, teaching what is good so that they may encourage the young women. They're supportive in their role. They're teaching what is good. Now, Paul isn't really using a word that refers to formal teaching, though you might do that. You have women's Bible studies and women's Bible study teachers, which is excellent. But he's talking about a personal level of teaching. This is a one-on-one mentoring. This is what you could refer to as tutoring. She is tutoring younger women. And think about it. Where does a younger woman go to find the right kind of teaching model for life? One of my favorite professors in seminary, Howard Hendricks, once said in class, in the world today we have plenty of celebrities and not enough saints. The pedestals are for the most part empty of saints. Evidently, God wants the church to step up to the plate. God wants the church to be the place where a young woman can come and find out how to live, to find the pattern for life. And the older women especially are going to be the key to this because they've lived long enough to have some experience in the home and especially in the marriage and in culture. You can imagine, can't you, for a moment? I mentioned in one of our earlier sessions that the island of Crete was inhabited by people who had descended from pirates. This would be a tough place to plant a church. This is a rough crowd. And they're coming out of a first century pagan culture. And these young women would have known virtually nothing about a marriage other than what they'd seen in culture. And what they'd seen is their husbands use wives, to bear children and to bear up a legal heir and mistresses for relationship. That would be the pattern of what they'd seen. And still divorce was extremely rampant. In fact, one Roman historian said the Roman women were said to date the years by the names of their husbands. So you can imagine the culture. In fact, you think of our own culture and the digression of marriage within our own culture. According to recently released a Pew study analysis taken from the most recent U.S. Consensus, we've reached that milestone, tragically, in our country where more adult couples are now cohabiting than marrying. We've actually reached the tipping point now where there are more each year choosing to cohabit than to marry. And you think about it, why bother with a covenant or a commitment for life when you can have all the physical benefits of marriage? You can have the financial benefits of marriage and even a child or two without having, the constriction of that kind of covenant, and you never really close out all your other options. That's why I've had young couples over my years of ministry sit in my office and tell me the 10 good reasons why it's better for them to cohabit as they are rather than marry. And it makes natural sense to the natural mind. In fact, today, if you choose to get married, keep in mind, if you didn't know it, you can rent wedding rings 1 month at a time. So it isn't really surprising, really, because these are the effects of a culture which is banishing the Bible, from the public square. And with that, you are welcomed back to the island of Crete that lived much like we're seeing our culture begin to live. And in verse 4, Paul says the solution to marriage and relationships in the home as older women tutor younger women is going to be these godly older women who step up and encourage younger women. You notice the word encourage here. It's actually another rare word. It never appears in this form anywhere else in the New Testament. And what it means is to bring to their senses. It means to train the senses. In our words, we might say older women are to wise up younger women. Wise them up. That's the idea here. Provide the curriculum of mentoring for them, which will bring them to their senses of what is really rational and right. And the first thing he talks about is the young woman's relationships in the family. Bring them to their senses. Train their senses as it relates to their relationships in the family. Notice verse 4, so that they may encourage, literally tutor the younger women to love their husbands and to love their children. The word for love is the word philos or philia, which means to be affectionate, to show affection, to have deep affection and friendship, which is kind of an odd comment, isn't it? How do you command someone's affections? How do you command someone to feel affectionate? To develop a friendship. You don't command, all right, go make that person your best friend. Okay. You don't command that, do you? Well, Paul is implying here that you do. In fact, on a deeper level, he's implying here that love can be learned. In fact, you can so think and so live that emotions are ultimately governed by right thinking and not the other way around. I live in a very metropolitan community. I'm a bedroom community south of Raleigh in a triangle. We're right in the middle of it, and you've got Duke University and UNC and NC State. So it is a small basketball town, as you can imagine. March Madness, hardly anybody goes to church. But at any rate, we're right there in the middle, and there are more PhDs per capita in that community than anywhere else in America, which makes it a very challenging area to live in. And what's interesting is it's a sort of a melting pot. And one of the fastest growing communities is the Asian community. Hispanic community in Raleigh is the fastest growing community in that community compared to any other community in America. So they're just sort of all melting in. Well, we have Indians. We have a Telugu Bible study on Friday night led by an Indian with Indians that come, and you can smell the curry throughout the building. Sunday after they've made their food, we have a Tagalog Bible study of Filipinos who also meet on our campus. They all converge on Sunday morning, an Asian community. But the Indians are interesting because many of them who come had arranged marriages. In fact, one of our deacons is Indian and met his wife on the week they were married. They had believing parents, and it was their culture to choose the spouse. I've got 4 kids. The older I get, the better I think that idea is, by the way. Don't hate me for that. But they arranged the marriage, and I'll joke with him when I see Raj in the hallway. I'll say, hey, man, how's that arranged marriage working out? And he'll laugh. They've been married 20 years. They met and learned to love. We're the other way around. What Paul is really doing is he's kind of taking us back and saying, you know what, you can learn to love. You just have to think right and think correctly, and your emotions ultimately follow. By the way, God tells us as believers to do this often. How's this sound? Rejoice evermore. I don't feel like it. Well, I didn't ask you if you feel like it. I just said rejoice. And when you start praising God, guess what happens? Your emotions follow like the caboose on a train. In everything, give thanks. I don't want to give thanks. Do it. When you give thanks, for this is the will of God, emotions become more grateful in following along. These are all commands that involve emotion. When we obey actions end up producing emotions. By the way, that's exactly how you tutor your children, right? Do you ask them, how do you feel tonight about doing your homework? You feel good about that? How do you feel about eating those vegetables? I would now ask, are they deep fried? If they're deep fried, I would say absolutely yes. In fact, I remember watching our twins. My wife had gone to visit her family. There was a sick relative in her family, and I said, honey, don't worry about it. I'm fine. Now, I don't cook. I can't do anything in the kitchen but make cereal. And so she said, well, what I'll do is I'll put out the box a Betty Crocker. I think it's Betty Crocker. It was tuna helper. And she said, all you have to do is boil the pot of water, and then you pour that box contents in there, and you stir it. And after, I don't know what it was, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, you serve it. I said, I think I can handle that. So I thought, this is great. There are no vegetables. You know, she didn't mention anything about that. That's too much work anyway. So I'm pouring the contents of this, and in falls all of those green peas. They're like little BBs. You could fire them from a rifle. And they poured in there, and I thought, how do I get them out without my kids finding out, because they'll tattle on me, I know. And would you believe it, I can't pick them out on their plates. They would notice that I'm doing that. And as I'm watching that pot thinking, how do I get them out of there? All of those peas floated to the surface, and I could scoop them up. That was an act of God's providence that allowed me to scoop those babies right out of there, and it was never better tuna helper. But you know what's funny? I eat vegetables now and have come to learn to like them. Why? Because I'm an old man. And I need those vegetables and that fiber and all those other things. I think differently about them, and now I'll order them and eat them. That's the idea here. The command of Paul through Titus is for women to be taught to think differently about their husbands and children. Well, that raises the question, what would they have been thinking about them? Well, if you go back into first century culture, there would have been deep resentment because they knew that they were simply to bear the child for the legal name, and the mistress, had all the fun, went to all the places, had all the enjoyment. They would easily resent their husbands and transfer that resentment to children, which were simply to bear his name for legal ownership and transference of rights and privileges. They would have been saved. These young women, they would have come to faith. They would have come into the church. And now they're introduced to this new thing called church, this new thing called a Christian family, this new thing called a Christian wife they never heard about. And this Christian home is totally different than anything they've ever seen modeled. And they've also, because they are young wives and young mothers, they've been married long enough, maybe even their husbands haven't become Christians, to understand now one of the grave disappointments to someone who gets saved, comes into the church, and they realize that Christianity didn't solve all those problems. Christianity wasn't this miracle drug that made me love my husband every day and adore my children every day. We still have problems. We can still not get along. We can still argue. And so they're going to need to know that, Christianity isn't this miracle drug against marital and parental challenges. Marriage is still the union of two fallen sinners. And you reproduce fallen sinners. So you better think correctly. In fact, the present tense of this verb to love your husbands means that this is going to be a daily decision and a daily challenge for every young wife and mother. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, by the way. You're so well led and so well fed. But mothers have the toughest job on the planet, right? And all the men said, mothers have the toughest job on the planet. And all the men said, there you go. There's a wise guy's going to eat lunch today. All right. Mothers are underpaid and overworked. And if you're like my mother, who raised 4 boys in that missionary home, my dad just retired at age 88 as a missionary. Okay. I hope I have his DNA. And I would hear her often say, "You never listen to me. I've got to reach this fever pitch before you even hear me." Now I'm married, and I hear my wife saying the same thing to my children. I got to reach this certain level. She's even said that to me a few times in our 36 years of marriage. You don't listen to me. Somebody in my church sent me this, and I thought, okay, this is too good. I got to share it with you about not listening. But at any rate, a man knew his wife's birthday was around the corner. So he asked her, he said, "Honey, if you could have one wish, what would it be?" She thought a moment, then laughed and said, "I'd love to be 8 again." And he just kind of tucked that away. He planned it all. On the morning of her birthday, he got her up, took her to the Waffle House for waffles and whipped cream, tall glass of milk. Next, they headed to a local theme park. And what a day. He put her on every ride: the death slide, the cyclone whip, the screaming loop, the wall of fear. Everything they had, he insisted she ride. 5 hours later, they stagger out of the theme park, and her head's reeling and her stomach's churning, but he takes her to McDonald's for a Happy Meal and a chocolate milkshake. And after they went then to the latest Disney animated movie, where they had popcorn and Pepsis, just sort of topping off this special day filled with 8-year-old adventures. Exhausted, she stumbled into the house that evening with her husband. She collapsed on the couch moaning. He sat down and said, "Well, now, honey, you got your wish. How did you like being 8 again?" One eye opened in surprise, and she moaned and said, "I meant my dress size." Nice try, man. Hey, you weren't listening, really. Well, how do we show love? Well, Paul, of course, is going to tell the husband how to show love to his wife in Ephesians. But here in Titus, he's elaborating on how the wife demonstrates it to her husband. And this is startling because it runs counterculture. You mean I am to become emotionally affectionate. I am every day to demonstrate the love that I should, the philia, toward him and toward them. Yes, that's what he's saying. In fact, that's why when I do marriages, ceremonies, when I've got that bride and groom standing in front of me, I often try to remember to say, because I think they'll probably remember it, and that's the statement: look, you're here today not because you have fallen in love. You did not fall in love. You are choosing to love. And that choice is daily. So train them in this manner as it relates to their family relationships. Train them, secondly, in their reputation. The second pair of commands appear in verse 5. These younger mothers and wives, notice, are to be tutored to be sensible and pure. The word sensible, by the way, if you've been with us, is the same word he used for older men. We'll see that tonight in younger men. The entire church family is also told to be sensible. So it's one of his favorite terms. But again, it has to do with balanced thinking, with right thinking. And then he throws in this word. He adds they should also be not only sensible, but pure. The word pure translates the idea of chaste or modest. It originally referred to ceremonial cleanliness. Over time, it kind of shifted to the moral realm. She is effectively commanded here, or to be taught by the older women, not to attract attention to her body. That is, her purity, that which she has inside her, is to be the demonstration of the gospel. It isn't her face, it's her faith that is to be commended in the church. So Paul knew that these young women, again, wouldn't have a clue. They lived in a culture that flaunted the body, much like ours does today. It flaunted its sexual expression and freedom. Prostitution is legal. Abortion is legal. And everything else thrown in. He's writing in a generation where their emperor Nero had married both a woman and a man publicly. Bisexuality was the norm. Everyone was told to experiment, much like young people are being told today. So they're coming out of that culture. They haven't had a godly mother, so they've never seen it modeled there. They're coming into the church, and they're going to have this model presented to them now of what it means to be pure, chaste, and whole. And I love the application of this command, by the way. He's actually implying to these young women, you may not have had the reputation for being pure in the past, but you can in the future. Teach them how to be pure means you can become pure. Let this be your new reputation. So he gives instruction regarding their priority now to their home and marriage. Notice verse 5, teach them to be workers at home. Workers at home is a compound word combining the word for house, oikos, and the verb to work, ergon. Literally, teach them to be house workers. Some translations render this keepers at home. This is where you get that expression, homemaker. Some would wrongly conclude that if she is to be the keeper of the home, then that means she must be kept at home. So you kind of get this idea that she's chained to the kitchen sink and she's got a dozen kids running around her bare feet. Well, Paul doesn't mean that at all. In fact, Paul doesn't mean that the only place a wife and mother can work is in the home, within those four walls and under that particular roof. In fact, for them in this particular culture, which was agrarian, she'd be working in the barn, the garden. She'd be working with other women in the community to meet the variety of needs in the community, as well as the church. Study the life of the virtuous woman, Proverbs 31, and she's going out to help the poor. She's selling real estate. She's down at the dock, bartering with the merchants. She's hiring and developing a staff of workers. And my wife has often joked with me, honey, I'll be a Proverbs 31 woman if you'll hire a staff for me, okay? You've got secretaries, I need one. And I just ignore her. But at any rate, she's got a great point. But I think, you know, when you think about the church right now on the corner of Tryon and Walnut in Cary, North Carolina, and Grace Community Church in Maryville, Tennessee, both churches would dry up and blow away in about 2 weeks or less if women weren't working here, serving here, dedicated to other children here, teaching other women here. See, Paul isn't so much defining the only place a wife and mother can work. What he is defining is that the home is the number one place, the number one priority for her energy and her work. And Paul is, again, this is counterculture. You have to understand, he is commending something brand new. This is radical truth. He's commending the role of a mother and a wife and a homemaker, which is the opposite of the island of Crete, which was all back then. He's as politically correct then as he is today. He's essentially commending the flock, and to the flock, a woman, a mother, a wife, and a homemaker, and virtually saying, this is a good thing. Make this your priority. Retrace your steps back home. Paul goes on to refer not only the priority of these young wives and mothers, but their mentality. Notice right in the middle of verse 5, he uses the word kind or kindness. You could render it. You could translate it goodness. In our language, we could refer to someone with this word being good-hearted, or a heart that is after what is good. What this means is that her desire for her husband and for her children is that which is good. Her mentality is conditioned to constantly be asking the question, would that be good for my children? Would that be good for my husband? Would that be a good activity for my family? Would that be a good habit? Would that be a good movie? Would that be a good thing to eat? I mean, would that be a good thing to wear? You just go down the list. And a good and godly homemaker is thinking, is this good for them? Her mentality is geared toward goodness. He goes on to refer not to just her priority and her mentality, but finally to her humility. He writes further in verse 5, being subject to their own husbands. Why? So that life will get easy for her? Look at it. Being subject to their own husbands so that problems will disappear? No. Being subject to their own husbands so that the word of God, so that the gospel will not be dishonored. Show this community a relationship that is so vastly different that it cannot help but honor the gospel of Christ. By the way, it's interesting, Paul uses the middle voice for this command to be subject, which means he's not telling men, here's your new theme verse. The middle voice means he's actually inviting the women to voluntarily submit to the leadership of their husbands. He's commending them to do it. You could render it to continually place yourselves under the leadership of your own husbands. And he expands on the idea in Ephesians 5 where he refers to the wife as the church. And the church submits to the leadership of Jesus Christ. The church engages in co-laboring with Jesus Christ. The church is one day going to reign with Jesus Christ. So also the wife is a co-heir, we're told, in the gospel. Yet we're also told that the husband then is to act toward his wife as Jesus does to the church, sacrificially, laying down his life, giving everything that he has for the sake of her. And I can tell you from personal experience that my wife finds it much easier to come under my leadership when I act like Jesus than at any other time. Now, this is a culture-wide issue, and it has nothing to do with essence, superiority, or inferiority. It simply has to do with the role that God has given us. Students submit to teachers. Basketball players submit to coaches. Church members submit to elders. Citizens submit to town councils. And when you leave the parking lot today, and you do about 3 blocks out of here, and you're laying down a little rubber, and that policeman pulls you over and comes up to your window and says, "Sir, would you show me your license?" What are you going to say to him? Look, how often did you go to church this week? How many verses have you memorized, sir? Do you think you're going to ask that officer anything related to his relationship with God? No. You're simply going to say, at least we do it in North Carolina, it's yes, sir. And sir always goes at the end of those kinds of discussions. Yes, sir. And if he says, I actually want you to get out of your car and put your hands on the trunk, just like this. I've never done this. I'm just pretending here, okay? But I would say, now wait a second. What kind of husband are you? Did you pay your taxes last year? No, has nothing to do with it, does it? Do you think you're a better person than me? Are you more human than me? Has nothing to do with essence. Has nothing to do with superiority. He just has authority I don't have. It's amazing how things work a little better when I respect his authority. So also, this isn't a discussion on inferiority or superiority or one person being better. This is simply the role that God has given men and women in order for the home to function in a way that honors the gospel of God. I was asked yesterday about my license plate, what it meant. I'm on my 7th pickup truck. You can tell by looking at me, I'm really not a pickup truck kind of guy. I'm more a Bentley guy. I just can't afford it. So I'm in a pickup truck. Actually, I've got an usher at our church that owns a Chevy dealership, and he gives me a good deal. I thought, I'm going to get a vanity plate. Anybody in here have a vanity plate? Any other vain person in here have a vanity plate? Or you're not going to admit to it. Well, and there aren't many of them, but I like to try to figure them out. I'll tell somebody around town and I can figure out their vanity plate. And I thought, you know what? I told my wife, I said, honey, I'm gonna go get a plate. And it's going to say shepherd, because I want to be reminded every time I get in my pickup truck, that's who I am, that I'm a pastor shepherd. Isn't that the coolest thing? Nod your head. That's just a great idea. Because she wasn't nodding her head. She's kind of looking at me with that look like you're on your own, babe. And so I decided to do it. I'm going to get shepherd. I just want to be reminded this is my my calling. So I went down to the DMV and waited in line for about 3 weeks. Finally made it up to the front. Does anybody here work for the DMV? Before I go any further. Okay, no vanity plates, no DMV workers. I'm protected. All right, here we go. Anyhow, poor thing. She's bored out of her mind. That's a tough job to have. Let's admit it. So I finally get up to the front of the line, and I said, I've decided. I don't know why I had to explain it to her, but I've decided to get a vanity plate. I was kind of embarrassed, but I'd like to get one that says, because I'm a pastor, and I want to get one that says shepherd, because that's, who I am. And she's just looking at me, and I said, well, type this in, SHEPHERD. She typed it in, looked up at me and said, sorry, somebody has it. Somebody in North Carolina has shepherd. And I had worked it up. I'd gotten so jazzed up about getting this vanity plate. And I'm standing there, and I didn't want to just walk away. And then it hit me. And I said to her, I'll bet nobody has it in Greek. I said, type this in, POIMENAS. She typed it in, looked up at me and says, well, what do you know? Nobody has it. Yes. So I got a license plate. Nobody knows what it means because it's in Greek, but it's poimenos if you're wondering. So I came home and I told my wife, I said, honey, guess what? Somebody had it in English, but I've got it in Greek. No lie. She looked at me. She's got a great sense of humor. She says, honey, with the way you drive, I'm glad it's in Greek. Nobody knows what it means, but at any rate, I will tell you this. I got to tell you, I was driving through the parking lot of this mall, and a guy behind me, not too long ago, starts honking at me. I mean, honking his horn. He's in a van behind me. And I'm thinking, my goodness, I didn't recognize him. So I pull over, and he pulls up to me and rolls his window, the passenger window down, and in broken English, he says, are you Reverend? And I said, are you Greek? He said, yes. I said, okay, I'm pastor. He said, I knew it. The only guy in my county that knows what my license plate means, which is probably a good thing. Authority is a problem when you break the law, because it wasn't long after that my license plate, well, here's what happened. I got a letter. And it was odd, because as I'm opening it, I was wondering why someone had sent me pictures of my pickup truck. I mean, it was nice looking. I'd gotten it washed, but there it was. And I read further, and some of you are laughing because you've been there. There are cameras at certain intersections, and it had taken pictures of me running a red light. Now, for the record, I am a pastor. I don't run red lights. I run yellow lights. That's right. And sometimes I don't run it fast enough. And there were 3 pictures of me. One was at the intersection in the left-hand lane. The other one was I was just a few feet ahead of that, and you could see the light over me, clearly red, and my pickup truck right there. And then a third close-up of my beloved license plate. I'm the only one that has it in the state of North Carolina. Poimenos. And then it told me that if I didn't want to go to court and argue it, and I'm looking at these pictures, and we can't argue it, send in $40, which I did. In fact, it was interesting. A week after that, the Raleigh News and Observer ran an article. It was a co-op, a humorous piece about a guy that had the same thing happen to him. And they used to complain about these cameras, and they were complaining about it. He was complaining about it. But what he said he did, he got the same letter, was told to send in, $40, and he thought he'd be a smart aleck. Since they sent photographs of him, he took two $20 bills and took a photograph of the $20 bills and sent in his money. A week later, he gets another letter back from the town, and it includes a photograph of handcuffs. So he sent his money, and that was it, end of discussion. So you know what? Hey, look, the way this authority thing works, it works well when I submit to it and I come under its leadership. It has nothing to do with those people down there at the DMV are better people than me, or wiser, or more godly. It's just they have authority that they have been given, ordained by God, according to Romans chapter 13. For men, it's authority not to be exploited. It's not to build our ego up or boss our wives around. It's a responsibility to be carried out for the benefit, asking ourselves the same question: is this good for her? Is it good for them? It's amazing what happens when that kind of relationship is taught. Ultimately, it retraces all of our steps back home. And that kind of home and this kind of relationship, this kind of demeanor, older men, older women, and younger mothers and wives, becomes a model to everyone living on the island of Crete and everyone in Maryville, Tennessee. You're different. And the Word of God is not dishonored. It is honored and obeyed. I'll stop here. Let me pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for giving through Paul and Titus instruction that may sound strange or odd, but we know intuitively in our hearts this does honor you. It does honor your word. It is different, and it is the difference that our island desperately needs to see. Enable these brothers and sisters to model these dispositions and relationships so that ultimately the gospel has a bridge into the hearts and lives of people. And the word of God is honored. We pray it. In Jesus' name, amen.